The year is 1204. In Constantinople, the greatest Christian city in the world, the Easter bells ring across a skyline of golden domes and ancient churches. Inside the convent of the Theotokos, 27 nuns kneel in prayer, their voices joining the chorus of monastic communities across the city celebrating the resurrection of Christ. Sister Anna, the abbess, is 63 years old. She has served in this convent for 40 years, surviving plagues, earthquakes, and the slow decline of Byzantine power. But nothing in her long life has prepared her for what's about to happen. Because outside the walls, an army flies the banner of the cross, soldiers who have taken holy vows to liberate Jerusalem. Warriors who have promised to fight only the enemies of Christ. These are Crusaders, and in 3 hours, they will prove that religious conviction means nothing when wealth and power are within reach. If you thought the Crusades were about defending Christianity, you're about to learn a truth so disturbing it was deliberately erased from most historical accounts. Here we uncover the documents that reveal how faith became a weapon. How holy vows justified atrocity, and how the greatest betrayal in Christian history unfolded in the name of God. Every view, every subscription helps us expose the lies that shaped centuries of religious mythology. Now, let's return to that convent because the bells have stopped ringing and the screaming is about to begin. To understand what happened in Constantinople, we need to understand how the Fourth Crusade became history's most catastrophic example of religious hypocrisy. In 1198, Pope Innocent III called for a new crusade to recapture Jerusalem from Muslim control. European nobles, knights, and common soldiers answered the call, motivated by a mix of religious devotion, promises of spiritual salvation, and prospects of wealth. The plan was straightforward: sail to Egypt, defeat the Ayyubid forces, then march north to Jerusalem. But plans change when money runs out. By 1202, the Crusader army had gathered in Venice but couldn't pay for the ships they needed. The Venetian Doge Enrico Dandolo proposed a deal. Help Venice recapture the Christian city of Zara on the Dalmatian coast, and the shipping debt would be forgiven. The Crusaders agreed, despite the fact that Zara was a Catholic city under the protection of the King of Hungary, who was himself a Crusader. Pope Innocent III explicitly forbade the attack, threatening excommunication for anyone who participated. The Crusaders attacked anyway. In November 1202, a Christian army flying papal banners besieged and conquered a Christian city. Zara was sacked, its churches looted, its population subjected to violence and theft. The Crusaders justified it as military necessity, a temporary detour before resuming their holy mission. Pope Innocent III excommunicated the entire Crusader army, then lifted the excommunication a few months later when they promised to continue toward Jerusalem. This pattern, sin, excommunication, absolution, would repeat itself on a far greater scale at Constantinople. In 1203, the Crusaders diverted again, this time to Constantinople, ostensibly to restore a deposed Byzantine emperor, who promised to fund the crusade and reunify the Eastern and Western churches. The politics were complex, the justifications elaborate, but the underlying truth was simple. Constantinople was wealthy beyond imagination, and the Crusaders knew it. The city fell in April 1204, after a brief siege. The Crusaders had promised they would restore order and then depart for Jerusalem. Instead, they unleashed 3 days of systematic destruction that remain one of history's greatest cultural catastrophes. What happened to the nuns of Constantinople during those 3 days is documented in multiple sources: Byzantine chronicles, Crusader letters, papal correspondence, and archaeological evidence. The pattern was consistent across the city's convents and monasteries. The soldiers went systematically from one religious house to another, and what they did there had nothing to do with military objectives or religious conversion. It was pure predation. At the convent of the Theotokos, Sister Anna heard the Crusaders breaking down the gate shortly after noon on April 13th. She gathered the nuns in the chapel, the only defensible room, and they barricaded the doors with benches and tables. They prayed together, clutching crucifixes and relics, believing that surely men who wore the cross on their tunics would respect women who had devoted their lives to Christ. The doors broke within minutes. French and Flemish knights poured into the chapel, their armor splattered with blood from earlier looting. They weren't there for the gold candlesticks or the embroidered altar cloths, though they would take those too. They were there for the nuns, Nicetas Choniates, a Byzantine historian who survived the sack and documented it extensively in his Chronicle Historia, writes with barely controlled rage about what happened in Constantinople's convents. He describes how Crusaders raped nuns on church altars, how women who had taken vows of virginity were violated repeatedly while their attackers laughed, how elderly abbesses were beaten when they tried to protect younger sisters. His account is not isolated propaganda. It's corroborated by multiple independent sources, including Crusader chronicles that mention the events with varying degrees of justification or shame. Geoffrey of Villehardouin, a French knight who participated in the Fourth Crusade and later wrote a detailed chronicle, admits that many evil deeds were done during the sack of Constantinople, though he avoids specific descriptions. Robert of Clary, another Crusader chronicler, is more direct, describing how soldiers seized women from convents and divided them like property, with knights claiming the youngest and prettiest for themselves while common soldiers took the rest. The pattern was systematic. Crusaders went from convent to convent following a similar procedure. First, they would break in, killing any male servants or guardians. Then they would strip the religious buildings of valuable items, gold, silver, jewels, sacred relics. Finally, they would seize the nuns themselves. What happened next depended on the individual soldier's inclinations, but the range of options was uniformly horrific. Some nuns were raped immediately in the convent buildings. Others were dragged to Crusader camps and held for days or weeks. Some were taken as concubines by individual knights and transported back to Europe when the crusade ended. In a few documented cases, nuns who resisted violently were killed. Sister Anna tried to place herself between the soldiers and the younger nuns. She was pushed aside, struck across the face, and forced to watch as the women she had protected for decades were violated in the same chapel where they had prayed hours earlier. Sister Maria, 19 years old, had entered the convent at 13, after her family was killed in an earthquake. She screamed for help, calling on God and the saints. The Crusaders laughed. They made jokes in French that Sister Anna couldn't fully understand but whose meaning was unmistakable. One soldier, wearing a surcoat emblazoned with a red cross over his heart, told Sister Maria that her prayers were useless because she worshipped the wrong kind of Christians. The theological justification for what was happening in Constantinople was elaborate and obscene. The Catholic Crusaders viewed the Orthodox Byzantines as heretics, schismatics, who had rejected the authority of Rome. This religious division, formalized in the Great Schism of 1054, had created a theological framework where Eastern Christians could be classified as less legitimate, less deserving of protection. Some Crusader priests actively encouraged the violence, arguing that by conquering Constantinople and subjugating its population, they were bringing wayward Christians back under proper Roman authority. The rape of nuns wasn't officially sanctioned policy, but neither was it punished. Church authorities in the Crusader camp knew what was happening. Military leaders knew, and they did nothing to stop it. In fact, multiple sources indicate that some religious items stolen from convents, including reliquaries and sacred texts, were distributed to churches in Western Europe as trophies of the successful crusade. The items were consecrated and displayed with honor, while the nuns who had guarded them remained captive or dead. The psychological torture of what happened to Constantinople's nuns extends beyond the physical violence. These were women who had dedicated their entire lives to serving Christ. Their virginity wasn't just personal virtue. It was their sacred offering, the foundation of their identity and religious purpose. To have that violated by men claiming to fight for Christianity created a spiritual devastation that matched or exceeded the physical trauma. Sister Anna, in the weeks after the sack, struggled with questions that had no answers. If these men were Christians, blessed by the Pope, fighting under Christ's banner, why had God allowed this? Was her faith wrong? Was Orthodox Christianity the heresy the Crusaders claimed? Or was religion itself meaningless, just empty words covering human cruelty? These questions appear in letters written by Byzantine survivors in the months after the conquest. A collection of correspondence between Orthodox bishops, preserved in monastery archives, reveals the deep spiritual crisis that the Fourth Crusade created in Eastern Christianity. Bishops wrote to each other trying to understand how such betrayal was possible. How men blessed by holy authority could commit such acts against women who served the same God. Some concluded that the Western Church had become corrupted beyond redemption. Others questioned whether any human institution could legitimately claim divine authority after such horrors. The practical consequences for the nuns were equally devastating. Those who survived the initial violence found themselves in an occupied city with no legal status or protection. Many convents had been completely destroyed, their buildings converted to barracks or stables. The nuns had no homes to return to, no communities to shelter them. Some were taken into what remained of Orthodox households, hidden and protected by families who risked punishment to help them. Others ended up homeless in a city that had become hostile territory. A few attempted to flee Constantinople but were caught by Crusader patrols and treated as escaped property. The concept that nuns who had been raped and kidnapped could be property reveals the complete moral collapse at the heart of the Fourth Crusade. Men who had sworn holy vows treated consecrated women as legitimate spoils of war, no different from gold or horses. The Fourth Crusade established a Latin empire in Constantinople that lasted until 1261. During those 57 years, the Orthodox Church operated under Catholic occupation, its monasteries and convents subject to Latin authority. Some convents were forcibly converted to Catholic rule, their Orthodox nuns expelled and replaced with Latin sisters. Other convents were simply dissolved, their properties distributed to Crusader nobles. The nuns of the Theotokos convent, those who survived, were scattered. Sister Anna died within months, according to a marginal note in a Byzantine manuscript found in a monastery library on Mount Athos. The note, written by a monk who had known her, says simply, "She could not bear to live in the city that had betrayed her God." Whether she died from illness, injury, or deliberately ended her own life, the manuscript doesn't specify. The younger nuns had varied fates. Some records suggest that at least 3 were taken to France and Italy by Crusader knights. Whether they lived as servants, concubines, or were eventually freed is unknown. One nun, Sister Theodora, appears in a Venetian document from 1215 requesting permission to return to Constantinople. Her request was denied. The historical impact of what happened in Constantinople extends far beyond the immediate victims. The sack of 1204 permanently damaged relations between Eastern and Western Christianity. The Orthodox world never forgot that the greatest assault on their faith came not from Muslims but from Catholic Crusaders. When Constantinople finally fell to the Ottoman Turks in 1453, some Byzantine commentators noted bitterly that at least the Ottomans had never claimed to fight in Christ's name while destroying churches and violating nuns. The religious hypocrisy of the Fourth Crusade undermined the entire theological foundation of crusading. How could these wars be holy when the soldiers fought fellow Christians? How could papal authority be trusted when it blessed armies that committed such atrocities? How could religious vows mean anything when men wearing the cross raped women wearing the veil? The questions shattered the moral certainty that had justified the Crusades, and they contributed to the eventual failure of the entire crusading movement. Pope Innocent III, when news of the Constantinople sack reached Rome, wrote letters expressing horror and grief at what had happened. But his condemnation was hollow. He had already lifted one excommunication when the Crusaders proved useful. He never excommunicated the knights who sacked Constantinople. He never demanded that they return the stolen relics or compensate the victims. The Catholic Church continued to benefit from treasures stolen from Orthodox churches, and many of those items remain in Western European churches and museums to this day. This is Christianity's most heinous treachery, not because the violence was worse than other historical atrocities. Violence has always been part of human warfare, but because it revealed the absolute bankruptcy of religious justification for violence. The Crusades were supposed to be different from ordinary wars because they were holy, blessed by God, fought for spiritual rather than worldly reasons. Constantinople proved that was a lie. The Crusaders cared about wealth and power just like any other army, and they were willing to destroy fellow Christians to get it. The cross they wore was just decoration, meaningless when real temptation appeared. If you find this history disturbing, if it challenges your understanding of religious warfare, if it makes you question how many other holy causes have been covers for human greed and cruelty, then you're beginning to see why history matters. The story of what happened to Constantinople's nuns in 1204 is not a comfortable story. It doesn't fit neatly into narratives about faith and heroism. But it's true, documented in multiple sources. And it reveals a pattern that repeats throughout history. When religion becomes a tool of power, those who suffer most are often the faithful themselves, betrayed by the very institutions that claim to protect them. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts on how religious authority has been weaponized throughout history. Subscribe to continue exploring the stories that complicate our understanding of faith, power, and human nature. Because the most important histories are often the ones that forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about what people do in the name of God.